Okay, so today we're focusing on Azure Data Factory. This is part of our demos arc, so thanks for joining. The other demos that we've done are up on our YouTube channel, so if you go back, we have one for Click, we have one for Looker.
Power BI, trying to think of what else we did.
Yeah.
ArcGIS is on there as well.
Yeah, so there's a couple other product demos up there. We are going to do a few more of these, and we'll announce those at the end. So as an overview, Azure Data Factory is a well-formed point-and-click ETL. It's a Microsoft product, so it integrates fully with the Microsoft suite and uses different connectors to other systems to ease the pain points that often come in ETL through raw code base. It's fully managed and serverless, so you don't have to worry about having significant management costs. That's all included. And it has these different segments that build to your overall pipeline. And those are the pipeline, the data set, the data flow, Power Query, templating, and linked services. And we'll get into what all of those are in just a minute. And finally, they do have fully functional source control. You can use Azure's integrated source control system, or you can directly connect to GitHub. And that will just dump all of your data directly into GitHub. It's in JSON format. It can be moved across systems and has come in handy in my work life. So as for pricing, it is a consumption model, which has its pros and cons. But overall, you have integration runtime price. So the integration runtime is the managed solution that actually runs the consumption. So you have the runtime price, and then you have VNet integration runtime price. And so that's a different management that solution that they do on top of Azure and Azure Data Factory. So there's a couple different options. There's also a self-hosted option and self-managed option, which is a little bit less expensive on the consumption cost, clearly, because you're managing it yourself. But they do up the price on things like orchestration and data movement because you're going off Microsoft to self-host. So they do kind of make up for that there. Azure has really differentiated itself as, and particularly Azure as a platform and Microsoft as an organization have presented themselves in a way where you could effectively do all of your data solutioning within Microsoft products. So they're fully integrated. You can use them in the same platform. It makes ease of use really high. This has its downsides that we'll get to in a minute, but that really is a differentiation point as opposed to platforms like dbt, which is solely a transformation platform, or a platform like Snowflake, which is solely a data lakehouse platform. So it allows you to do that full integration. So as I said, you're able to build a comprehensive data solution within a single code base. It also allows you to build this data solution without having significant technical resources. So because it is point and click, as with most of the things within the Azure platform, you can do some custom coding in the background, but because it's a single code base and because it's point and click, it does allow you to decrease the number of technical resources that you need in what has become a very scarce market. They have end-to-end consumption monitoring out of the box. So you pay for the Azure Monitor function, and end to end, you have logging, you have consumption, you get details around like what your billing looks like and how much you're spending on at a very minute level. So you can see like this individual query that ran at this time cost you this much money. And then finally, SSO and security. Microsoft has always been known for being highly secure and always being up on the latest trends and needs of the security community. And this allows you to, again, across all of your systems, have that single security solution. So you're not worrying about integration between different platforms and how is your data encrypted as it flows between them? What is your data at rest doing? It's all within Microsoft, and so it's all supported by the Microsoft security solution. So a couple of pros and cons before we jump into the platform. Consumption-based pricing is, I find, often a better solution, especially when you're going across dev, test, and production environments, because often at the outset of your project or your solution, you will be developing. So your consumption prices are going to be sky high. You're running pipelines constantly, trying to fix bugs, trying to figure out exactly what you need. But when you move to the test environment and the production environment, and your development environment is pretty quiet, you're not using that as much. So consumption goes down and price goes down. Whereas if you pay for licensing, your price is constantly the same, even though you're using, you're running maybe 3 times a day. On the other hand, Microsoft does have a fairly obfuscated formula for these payments. So understanding consumption at the outset, they do have a calculator on their website. I've used it a couple times for clients, and it gives a good range, but I often find that the range doesn't necessarily match up to what ends up happening, especially within the first few months of development. It does seem to match up more over long term, though. So as you average out into your test and production environments, that range does seem to catch up. So both a pro and a con. This is a Microsoft integrated product, which, as I mentioned before, can be very helpful. It means that you're fully integrated across the system. It means that you don't have to worry about your data moving anywhere and therefore having potential security risks. You can have AD integration, and yeah, so all of the reasons that people go for Microsoft and go for a single organization solution. However, that does mean that you're tied to the Microsoft platform. So you can't be organization agnostic. You can't be product agnostic. You can't say, I want to, I've been on Synapse, which is one of their databasing solutions. I've been on Synapse for a couple of years now. I'm finding that I need the solutions that are more, more fleshed out in Snowflake, and have all of your stuff migrate to Snowflake easily. That becomes an entire project in and of itself of migrating. Whereas individual level solutions, so things that are very niche, often allow you to pick up the entire solution and migrate it. So whether it's through Parquet files or it's through backpack files or integration connectors, smaller solutions and more niche solutions often are more compatible with other products that are not within that solution because they're niche. They know they have to connect with other products and other code bases. It also means that it's not open source. Obviously, Microsoft is not an open source platform. I prefer to have open source platforms because it means that there's a pretty massive community that is willing to have conversations about the code if you ever get stuck. Through like Slack channels, community boards, all of that kind of stuff. And there tends to just be more information out there. Whereas I have found with Microsoft that if I run into a bug, it is fairly difficult to find any documentation on it without reaching out to a support agent. It's a point and click GUI, so it's easy to use, it's cohesive, it is available to non-technical users. So someone could, having never written a piece of code before, log into Azure Data Factory and start to build. On the other hand, it's difficult to customize. There are options to jump into scripting at different locations, but in general, it is meant to have that ease of use. And so the scripting overall is not great. And finally, they have built-in connectors, and we'll go through a bunch of them as we go through ADF itself. One issue that I've run into is that they do have pretty significant limitations on what their connectors are. You can get around that by using JDBC connectors, webhooks, APIs, other like generic solutions that they have built in, but that requires a lot more configuration by the owner of the product. So if you're the developer, you have to do a lot more configuration for something that is not directly integrated into the Azure Data Factory connections. Okay, so that's all my slides. Before I jump over, does anyone have any questions? Okay. Okay, so we're going to jump into, I'm going to touch a little bit on Azure as a platform so that I can show all of you how to actually build a data factory within Azure. You will get more into Azure as an overall solution in one of our demos in, I think, about a month. So we will get deeper into this. This is just going to be the things connected to ADF. So when you log into Azure, it looks like this. You have a variety of resources available, and within subscriptions, resource groups, all of it's really configurable in an easy way. To build a data factory, you create a resource. Under Data Factory, hit create. And then you pick a resource group. And what these resource groups do is they allow you to cordon off different projects. So if you want to see consumption, billing, etc., on specific elements of a project or on individual projects, you can parse them out into different resource groups. And that'll allow you to see all of that as the individual, as opposed to all of your objects that live in Azure at once. Then you create a name. The names are sometimes a little finicky. They do have a lot of requirements on naming conventions. This one you can't have spaces, and I don't think you can have uppercase letters. And then they do have to be unique within your subscription. So within your given Azure tenant or subscription, you do need to have uniqueness across all of your resources. The region you're in is usually the region you want to select, because that means that your data center is located somewhat nearby, and so consumption costs are lower. The data doesn't have to process all the way from California if you're in New York, and it speeds up processing time. Here is where we get into that source control that I mentioned earlier. So we are actually going to configure Git later on this, because it can be a little finicky when you configure Git here in the setup of the data factory, but you'll be able to do it once you get into the data factory itself. So I don't worry about the rest of these. You can set networking stuff, you can do encryption, and you can put tags on things. I don't generally do that, especially at the outset. You can always go and configure those later. So then you go to create, and then your data factory will be deployed. We're not going to work in this data factory because I have a pipeline set up in another one, but these are the steps you have to go through to actually build the data factory resource itself. So now we're going to jump into our data factory. Cool. Okay, so this is our SCDC demo data factory. So there are a few different prompts at the beginning where you can quickly go and set up a pipeline, set up orchestration, and do data flows. Oh, and I forgot to mention, it does configure with SSIS. So if you have pipelines, reporting, anything like that done in SSIS, you can run those packages here in Azure Data Factory. The first thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you that Git configuration. So this is where you would do your Git configuration directly in the data factory solution itself. So this is our Salt City Data Community GitHub. So if you're interested in seeing all of this code, you're welcome. It's a public GitHub account. You're welcome to go and download it and play around yourself. They do offer a 30-day free trial. So if you just want to, you know, play in the sandbox, it is available to you. So this gives you the option between GitHub and Azure DevOps again. And then it allows you to pick your collaboration and publishing branches. And what that does is identifies effectively what your branch versus your main is within your source control. Another important point within the Manage tab here is linked services. So these are all of the different connections that you'll be making to external applications. So for example, these are all of the different native connectors that are built into Azure. So you can see there's some Amazon stuff, Apache, a lot of Azure stuff, obviously. Cassandra, Drill, you know, a bunch of stuff that is generally well known within the data community. One thing I do find interesting about this that I found comes up as a use case fairly often is this does not connect to SharePoint. So if you have files within SharePoint that you want to use as a basis for your data flow, or you want to bring into your data mart or whatever, SharePoint does not connect to Azure Data Factory. You can bring in a SharePoint list, but you can't actually use a functional document. So yeah, these linked services, they connect you to your external applications, to your data, whatever, and allows you to start building. So we already have one here. this is, I built a blob storage container. So we have a blob storage container. Because it's within Azure, it's really easily connectable. You can pull directly from your Azure subscription, and it will create a key for you, and it'll automatically manage that key. So I think it's every 90 days it cycles out keys, and you don't have to manage this at all. So that tends to be the baseline for anything Azure related. All of the things that are integrated within the Microsoft platform are really easy to integrate. Once you get outside of the Azure platform, it becomes more and more difficult to integrate and transform that data. So now into the data flows and pipelines themselves. So as I mentioned, there's pipelines, data sets, data flows, Power Query templates, and the link services that we just went over. Pipelines are your overall ETL, effectively. Within your pipeline is the build for an ETL. You can nest your pipeline. So there's a function called, if I can find it, execute pipeline. So you can build a bunch of pipelines, and then you can create another pipeline that has a trigger that runs all of your pipelines for you. So you can create nesting features. You can have webhooks that will trigger an external application when something finishes running. So I have a use case right now where the client is using ADF solely for loading the data. There's no transformation done in ADF. And then we're outputting to dbt, which is a transformation tool. So, what the webhook does is all of the data is loaded here in Azure and dumped into a Snowflake database. And then once the Azure code stops running, there's a webhook that then goes and triggers the code in the other application. So there's no manual intervention at all. It's fully automated. Yeah, and there's a ton of other functions that are built in. The very basics of Azure Data Factory are these two functions here, copy data and data flow. Copy data is a copy activity that brings any external applications data into Azure Data Factory. Within a copy data activity, you can't do any transformations, but it is a requirement for any external application or hosted database or whatever you're bringing into the solution if it's not an Azure product. So if it's an Azure product, you can go straight into your data flow. If it's not an Azure product, you have to use the copy activity first and then plant it in like as JSON into a blob storage or something like that as a staging table, and then do your data flow transformations. Here, because we are using Azure Blob Storage, we can jump right into a data flow. So we have this sole piece of our pipeline, and then we're going to jump into a data flow. So over here, we have data flow 1. And then we have our data sets. So I pulled these data sets off of Kaggle, which Ashley has talked about a couple of different times. She uses it much more aggressively than I do, but Kaggle is a really great data science community that community members, they post projects, different code that they've done, data sets that they've built. So there's a lot of free data sets on Kaggle that are really interesting and not available anywhere else because it's community driven. So yeah, check it out. It's cool. Oh, you can also do like, Ashley, what are they called? Like the competitions?
Yeah, they have the competitions on there. I can't remember if there's like a technical name for it, but yeah, they do stuff with there's prizes, or some of them are just kind of ones that they've had around forever. I know the like Titanic data set is like a big one for kind of tutorials that they have for machine learning.
Yeah, so It's a really great community of data scientists if you're interested in learning more or just getting free data sets, which I enjoy. Okay, so these are the data sets we're going to use, and what these look like is CSVs that are being brought in through the blob storage that we have in our Azure solution. So because this is a CSV, it has all of the configuration for CSV. I have my first row as a header because that's what exists in my CSV. You can pull in your schema. So to do this, you just hit import schema and it'll bring in all of the columns and their data types. And then you can edit your schema if needed. And then finally, you can build parameters into your data sets. I don't use this too often, but it can be very helpful if you're getting into more complex pipelines. Okay, so all of the data sets look like that. They're very similar. And what we're doing with these data sets is bringing them into a data flow. Uh-oh. Okay. So I had built out a data flow, but we'll just go through a couple pieces of this so that you can see some of the functionality of the data flow capabilities. So we have our 4 sources here, and what we can start doing is building different functions into them. So you do need your data flow debug on to actually look at your data. That does cost consumption price, but it doesn't take up a lot of consumption because it's a debug, not a trigger. So with your data flow debug on, we can go and look at our data. While we wait for that to fetch, I'll go through some of these other options. So to set up your source, this is the basic stuff you need. Is it data set or inline? What set you want to do? I think my issue, Thomas, is I didn't commit before I closed this earlier. So that's on me. I should have built, although yeah, okay. I just didn't save it. So as I opened a new instance, I couldn't save it. So that's where GitHub comes in handy. You can save all of your work if you remember to. Okay, so we can jump between these two as we go through these. So we can look at our data. Here. So now we see that we have disease data with different symptoms, and any disease can have up to 16 symptoms within this. I think it's actually 17. Yep, 17 symptoms within this initial disease data set. However, I like to work with long data, not wide data. And so what I want to do with this is get all of the symptoms in the same column. So I effectively want to unpivot this. So I can go in here, I can select unpivot. You want to ungroup by your individual column. And pivot key is just a column you define. So we're going to use symptom. And you can define your type. We know that this is a string. And then we can define our unpivoted columns. So we want to bring all of these symptoms into this unpivoted column. So we just go through, you can add different columns as you need to. So we'll go through 10. There aren't a lot of columns that have data beyond that. And it'll just take a while to do this. We can go through this, and then you can use this handy little function here that says drop rows with null. So as we saw in our data preview here, there's a lot of nulls, especially as we get further to the right in our data set. So what we can do here is drop rows with null, and then we can go and preview the data now. So what this will look like is 2 columns. Yeah, so some of these columns will be staying in, but within the first column, we're now seeing we have our definer column that is just indicating symptom, and then we have our symptoms here. So you can see patches in throat. Unfortunately, it looks like this data set has hard-coded nulls. So we have another way of getting rid of those rows that we don't want to see. So that's the first modification we can make. The next one, we want to drop the symptom columns that we aren't using. So we can select the columns that we want to see. And we can say we want disease, symptom, and symptom 0. And that's all we want to see. So now in our data preview, oh, right. So we want to delete all of these. Now in our data preview, we'll end up with 3 columns. So we have an indication of what symptom level each of these is, and then we have the symptom itself. Next, we want to get rid of those nulls, so we'll go into a filter function. No nulls. And then you can code directly in here, or you can operate in the expression builder. So what we want to do is we want symptom 0 to not equal null. And there's a bunch of other functions you can do in here to use. There's, you can do equal or not equal or greater than, less than, the date. You can count, you can do all sorts of stuff within the expression builder. So now when we go and preview our data, now we see that we aren't seeing the nulls here listed. So that's really great for our disease data set, but we don't just want our disease data set. We want to use all of the data sets that are available to us. So within here, we can use join functionality to join to this. So then we can bring in description. We can say we want full outer because we want to see all of the data. We just want to see the relationships that that data has to one another. And so here we can select disease. Here we select disease. So within no nulls, if disease equals descriptions disease, we'll join on that. Now we have our symptom descriptions. So in addition to the symptom, we have this diseases and symptoms description. Next, we're going to join on another one of these. So we'll do the same thing. This is going to be precaution, join. We're going to join on disease again. And when we go and preview that data, we'll now see the precautionary recommendations. So now we have more data that we can do. We could theoretically go back and unpivot these precautionary measures as well. So we would have a long list of precautionary methods, a long list of symptoms, and then both connected on that disease row. We have this additional data set for symptoms. We're going to skip it just for time's sake. I have one last thing to show everyone. So whenever you build a data flow, you have to have a sink, and a sink is where you're sending that data. So we have our sink here. This is going to be to our blob. And so I'm going to build a new data set that goes to our blob. So we have Azure Blob. It's going to be a CSV. We already have our linked service set up, so we can just select that. And this is the final output data set. You can go and select where that lives. And then put our first rows as headers. There's some different settings you can do on this. You can do error logging into a specific spot. So usually if I'm staging in blob storage, I'll have a separate container within that blob that's specifically for logs, and I'll just send logs there so that I have an idea of what may be breaking as I debug. This mapping shows the data going from what you've built here into this solution. And one really interesting thing about this is if you're syncing to a database, the table built in that database, that schema will also be available here. So you'll be able to see if your data types and data names are matching the output file that you're expecting. Partitioning options, and then you can inspect and look at the data that you have here. And then when we run this, so we would save all. And then when we would go to run this, you could either debug, which is going to run on the Azure Integrated Runtime. And that will just, give you errors. It'll identify any issues in your solution. And then you can add a trigger. So you can build a trigger that's like a scheduled trigger, or you can just trigger now, and that'll trigger your entire pipeline as if it is in production. So you can do production runs and testing on production runs before you push to test or prod. Okay, I just talked for a really long time. I'm gonna stop sharing, and please ask any questions that you may have.
It's always a question of whether the graphical gets in the way, versus like a coding type development situation. And just, I guess I'll just leave that as a, comment/question.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Especially when you get into deep into coding and can leave comments and be collaborative in that way. These GUI solutions don't necessarily allow you to do any of that, which can make collaboration a little bit more difficult.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Can you do analysis? So you can do some functionality of analysis where you can like build aggregations and stuff like that, but this is truly meant as an ETL tool, so extract, transform, load, or ELT tool. And then there are other solutions within the Microsoft suite that do the analysis. So you can connect to Power Automate, or you can connect to Power BI, and those are both heavy analysis tools. BI is a visualization tool, and then with Power Automate, you can build reports and push through APIs or send reports to people over email notifications, different stuff like that.
How does it compare, in your opinion, to other ETL tools that you've used, just kind of on an overall basis?
I think it is structured well. So once you have your logic set, you can set templates, and that structure will be extremely stable for you. I have found that you have to increase your concurrency to operate on large data sets. So right now I'm working in on a project that unions 11 different databases together. So we have these really long tables, like an invoice or a transaction table, unioning across 11 different databases, and it makes a giant table. And I've found that this has trouble processing that. So some good, some bad.
Got it. And if you're working in the Azure ecosystem already, let's say like one of your clients is already an Azure sort of company, then I imagine it's a good sort of, there's a lot of synergy. If you weren't, would you go out of your way to use this tool, or what would be your, what's that?
I would not.
And what would be your go-to if it was totally your choice and you were kind of ecosystem agnostic? What's your sort of go-to alternative?
So Informatica is a really great solution that has a highly robust ETL. And then I'm really liking this solution I'm using lately called DBT, which we're going to give a demo on in another 2 weeks. And that is solely a transform and load solution. So you need to have a structured database to run it, because it doesn't run on its own consumption. It runs on your database's consumption, but it runs all of your stored, or it builds all of your stored procedures, all of your transformation code, anything like that. It will build and then convert into whatever database you're connecting into. So it has its own language. And then you use the same code, whether you're connecting to a MySQL, to a Snowflake, to a, to Postgres, anything like that. It'll translate the code for you. So that's really good if you know that you're going to have scaling issues where you're using a database that is meant for smaller organizations, but you know in 3 years you're going to need to move to a larger solution. So you can keep that same code base. So I really like that one lately.
Great. Yeah, thanks. That's quite insightful.
Anyone else? Okay, if there aren't, oh, what is the tool again? The tool is Azure Data Factory. I will put a link to their like marketing page in the chat here. Okay, so we're coming up on the hour. We did have a few announcements. So this is a continuation of our demos arc. We will be doing the demos arc throughout September and maybe some of October. Our next one is already scheduled on our meetup. We're going to do a demo of DBT, which I mentioned during this meetup. And then beyond that, we're going to do Azure. We're going to look at Apache, and there's one more that I can't remember. We will be taking a break. So we're going to do our DBT meetup is going to be on the 9th. And then our next meetup won't be until September 13th. So there will be a significant break there.
And then if anyone has any questions you can think of later, feel free to reach out to Amanda and I on LinkedIn. We'll always free to answer stuff there as well.
Absolutely. Thank you everyone for joining and have a great night.
Thank you. Great overview.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.